This video is brought to you by Captivating History. The Underground Railroad was a network developed in the early 19th century to help runaway slaves in the U.S. escape to freedom. Composed of brave men and women from across the United States, the railroad helped to free around 100,000 people during the period leading up to the American Civil War. The stories of those running the Underground Railroad remain a great inspiration and a testament to the goodness of humankind in the face of great evil. After the American Revolution, America quickly became divided over slavery. While slavery obviously ran counter to American ideals of liberty, it made some people very wealthy while ridding them of a life of hard labor. As immigrant workers replaced slaves in the North, the abolitionist movement became more popular, and state after state outlawed slavery. By 1804, every state north of Maryland had chosen to renounce its practice, while the slave-owning South continued to resist change as large plantations became increasingly profitable. Calls for nationwide abolition began to grow, but many white Americans argued it was too risky to emancipate the slaves. Some feared that, once freed, scores of abused men and women would wreak bloody vengeance on their old masters. Even Thomas Jefferson, a one-time advocate of abolition, argued that America had a wolf by the ears and could not afford to free its slave population. Many pro-slavery advocates would also claim that Africans were racially inferior and that they would not benefit from freedom if they had any. While some slave owners were harsher than others, in general, the life of a slave in the American South was filled with unimaginable cruelty. A large majority of slaves worked picking cotton or tobacco, a monotonous job they carried out from dawn till dusk 6 days a week. Slaves were often whipped, beaten, raped, kept in squalid conditions, and allowed little food or sleep in order to keep them docile. By the time slavery was at its height in the U.S., the life expectancy of an average American slave was just 36 years. Although the life of a slave was often horrific, few slaves risked escaping to the free North. Most were too brutalized and too scared to run, and most of those who did get away were simply brought back and punished. On top of this, it became illegal to educate slaves, and few slaves could even read a map. Escape was made even more challenging by the two Fugitive Slave Acts passed in 1793 and 1850. These pieces of legislation allowed slave owners to track down escaped slaves living in free states, and those caught sheltering runaways received a heavy fine. In the lead-up to the Civil War, dangers presented by slave catchers operating in the northern U.S. caused most fleeing slaves to head to Canada. At this time, Canada was still part of the British Empire, which had abolished the slave trade in its colonies in 1833. While some lone men and women did successfully make the journey to the border, it soon became clear to abolitionists that organized planning was necessary to help slaves get away from their masters. The early origins of the Underground Railway are somewhat obscure because the network operated secretly. Still, we know it soon evolved to become a vast collection of safe houses and valuable contacts that help escapees make the arduous journey to freedom. This network came to be known in the newspapers as the Underground Railroad, although it had nothing to do with either the railways or subterranean passages. Slang connected to the railways was soon adopted to describe these secret routes. For example, safe houses were known as stations or depots, and those who sheltered slaves were known as station masters. Those who helped slaves get out of plantations were called conductors. A large percentage of those involved were African Americans, many of whom were ex-slaves, often risking being hung to sneak into plantations disguised as slaves. Railroad conductors would then wait until nightfall to ferry fugitives to safety, following a great chain of safe houses that led all the way to the Canadian border. These operations often took place under the cover of darkness because the participants usually had to evade slave catchers as they ran. The majority of those escapees also came from border states rather than the Deep South, as they had much shorter distances to travel. Some of the first people involved in these networks came from various religious communities with strong moral objections to slavery. The Quakers, in particular, were some of the earliest white abolitionists, having collectively declared slavery immoral as early as 1688. Although many Quakers would hold slaves regardless, several key figures in the early Underground Railroad were from this radical Christian sect. One of the first men we know of to assist fugitive slaves was a Quaker named Levi Coffin. While he was living in North Carolina, Levi attempted to teach slaves to read and write, despite the dangers. Before long, he left the state to avoid the rising violence caused by pro-slavery advocates. Undeterred, in the 1820s, Coffin set up a safe house for runaways in the free state of Indiana. He and his friends created an anti-slavery network across Indiana and Ohio, and his home became known as the Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad. Another early Quaker abolitionist and member of the Underground Railroad was Isaac Harper, a simple tailor who lived in Pennsylvania. He would house hundreds of fugitives throughout his lifetime. Harper later moved to New York to run a bookshop where anti-abolitionists attacked him. Despite the bad feelings against him, Harper would prevail, and like Levi Coffin, he would soon find common cause with other anti-slavery advocates living in New York. Among them was David Ruggles, one of America's first African-American journalists who helped the writer and statesman Frederick Douglass escape slavery in 1838. Besides the early efforts of the Quakers, many ex-slaves and free African Americans were heavily involved in the movement. One of the most successful station masters in U.S. history was an ex-slave, Jarm Logue. Jarm had escaped to Canada as soon as the British Empire abolished slavery. However, he soon crossed back into the U.S. despite the dangers. Jarm changed his name to Jermaine Wesley Logan and studied theology at the Oneida Institute in New York, after which he became quite successful. Jermaine and his wife, Caroline, sheltered about 1,500 runaway slaves on their massive property during their lifetime, earning themselves the nickname the King and Queen of the Underground Railroad. Many other ex-slaves helped with the Underground Railroad, but by far the most famous of them all was the formidable and notoriously brave ex-slave, Harriet Tubman. Harriet was characterful, tough, and deeply religious. She felt strongly compelled to help her fellow man. She had vivid spiritual visions throughout her life, which may have been caused by a severe head trauma she experienced at 12 years old. After her head injury, she suffered from narcolepsy and headaches for the rest of her life and was considered feeble by her masters, although she was anything but. After Harriet successfully escaped in 1849, she came back multiple times to free her family and friends rather than fleeing to safety. She would continue to sneak into plantations during the period leading up to the Civil War, and she carried a shotgun on her secret missions in case trouble occurred, leading slaves on the long route north. She never lost a single person under her care, partly because she used her firearm to threaten anybody who got scared and tried to turn back. Harriet's daring activity would continue during the American Civil War when she became a spy for the North. Besides secretly passing intelligence back and forth to the Union Army, she helped free over 700 slaves in South Carolina. Harriet Tubman was so greatly revered by the time of her death that she soon became known as the Moses of her people. Leading up to the war, Harriet Tubman was close friends with the most controversial Underground Railroad conductor of them all, the abolitionist John Brown. Brown believed that violence was necessary to bring justice to the slaves. His activities were so outrageous that they are sometimes cited as one of the many causes of the American Civil War. Brown's father had been a station master, and John took up the same role when he grew up, forming the League of Gileadites, whose members protected fugitives from slave catchers. Initially, Brown worked peacefully as part of the Underground Railroad, but his activities became increasingly radical and more violent as he got older. Brown moved to the deeply divided border state of Kansas in the 1850s, when partisans on either side were starting to clash violently over slavery and abolition. Brown was personally involved in some of these clashes, including the infamous Pottawatomie Massacre, during which 5 pro-slavery settlers were killed. Brown's military-style activities represented the crossover from the covert activities on the Underground Railroad to the open violence of the coming Civil War. After Brown and his militia attempted to incite a slave revolt by seizing the military arsenal at Harper's Ferry, he was condemned for his illegal actions. After being cornered by the Southern General Robert E. Lee, Brown was hanged for treason in 1859. The passions that moved Brown and so many others would culminate in the American Civil War, which broke out less than 2 years later in 1861. During the Civil War, the railroad continued its operations for several more years until President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, officially abolishing slavery across the U.S. Abolitionists began to work in the open instead of secretly, and by 1865, the Union had won the war, ending the need for the Underground Railroad altogether. The evil institution of slavery that had swallowed up so many lives had finally come to an end. To learn more about the Underground Railroad, check out our book, The Underground Railroad, a captivating guide to the network of routes, places, and people in the United States that helped free African Americans during the 19th century. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. Also, grab your free Mythology Bundle ebook while still available. All links are in the description. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.